Why hello there everyone, and welcome back to another game related educational video. Now we've really come a long way in terms of gaming. I mean, now we have these big meaty action adventure games that last hundreds of hours and offer loads of entertainment, when back in the day the closest thing you really had to, well, this was, well, this. So I think it's really interesting to see how far we've come and to look back at what gaming was like in the very beginning. So let's go back to when gaming really started, in the 70s. Now I'd argue gaming became, well, necessarily good in the 80s with the invention of, well, good games. The 70s games really have their charm, and some of the most famous retro games were invented in this era, like Breakout and Pong. Now, the first video game ever was technically invented in 1958, and it was this very, very simple game, which didn't even have a name, but it was essentially just Pong, but like an even more old version of Pong is how I describe it. I believe it was nicknamed Tennis for Two or something, and it was basically invented by, like, scientists, because, you know, in 1958, computers were basically a new thing, so to make actual playable games was a very big challenge. But hey ho, they did it. Arcade cabinets were a thing before home consoles, of course, because, you know, they were big, and they could store loads, and they could have their own controller, and they didn't have to fit much games in them, so clearly they were a thing for quite a while. But with the invention of home consoles, that's where things start to get more interesting. The first home console ever was in 1972, and it was called the Magnavox Odyssey. This thing's big gimmick is that I could play different games while putting in different circuit boards. That's right, not cartridges, literal circuit boards, and they didn't have names, they had numbers. Ah yes, my favourite game. 2. Now, most of these games were pretty much just very, very slight different versions of, essentially, Pong. But weirdly, they had even weirder controls than Pong. You could basically move anywhere you want, and they managed to create actual games with overlays, which came with every single game, which you put over your TV, and it would essentially act as a board game almost. The actual game itself is just you and a friend moving a square around. Maybe occasionally another square comes into play, depending on the different game. Now, there were hardly any games that came out on this thing, but the most famous are Pong, Simon Says, Football, and State Name. Now, all of these games are based on the names, not what you'd expect. They were basically, I don't even know how to describe them, just look at these things. The controller's really weird. It's like this big brick with some knobs and buttons. It looks like it would weigh like 10 pounds. Also, this thing's complicated as all hell to plug into your TV. Seriously, you gotta screw in all sorts, you gotta connect things. Well, I guess that's kind of obvious, but you've gotta sync up different radio waves. It's just rocket science. Maybe it's just because I'm a little dumb baby, but still, it really makes you thankful for the HDMI cable, huh? Now, this thing certainly didn't fail, as it pretty much just had a nothing but an uphill market. In 1975, Atari Pong came out. I don't know what to tell you. It's Pong. It's a console. And it plays Pong. I don't really know what else to say. But with the success of Atari Pong, loads and loads of developers made their own Atari Pong-esque consoles, and they sold incredibly. I actually have one of them. I did a bit of research, and I'm pretty sure this thing came out in 1978 or 1976, I'm not sure. But this thing is old. Like most Pong consoles, this thing had quite a few games built in, and by quite a few, I mean 4. It had simple Pong, you know, just Pong. And if you can't tell, the reason I'm doing so badly right now on the footage is because I'm controlling this with 2 different controllers in 2 hands, so it's kind of awkward to control with one person. It had hockey/football, which is essentially just Pong but with another stick. It had squash, which might be one of my favourites to be honest, and I had this one-player training mode, which honestly isn't that fun. The controls really nail what they're trying to do, and it feels really smooth moving the sticks. However, the actual console feels really fragile and like thin plastic. It almost feels like it's going to fall apart even just slightly moving it. In fact, the back connector did actually fall off at one point, but they managed to get fixed. It's kind of weird how all the sounds come out of the console itself and not the TV. But what's probably even more unhealthy is that whenever I turn up my TV while this thing is plugged in, it has this sound. That's probably not healthy. But this thing does have some charm to it. Now in 1976, the next big home console came out, the Fairchild Channel F. This was the first home console that used proper cartridges. The controller was really weird. It was like this baton with a wheel. You could pull and push it and press a button and twist it. But I had no other buttons except from the wheel. And these games could do way more than the Atari Pong and any other Pong console and the Magnavox Odyssey. This thing had games such as Maze, Hockey, Tennis, Tic-Tac-Toe, Maths, and Blackjacks. I think this thing's a big improvement from the Magnavox Odyssey and most Pong consoles, but weirdly, it completely failed. It's probably because the price was way more high, but no one bought this thing. But now we're moving on to the big leagues. The Atari 2600 came out in 1978, and if you ask me, it's the first console that really succeeds at what it's trying to do. It was absolutely great for the 70s. And while the games don't hold up as well today, they were incredible for its time. But these games just look starved. Yeah, these graphics aren't too pretty, but they're perfectly playable. And oh my lord, so many games came out on this thing. And I believe this was the first console that had licensed games based off movies and stuff, like E.T. and Spider-Man and other stuff. And some absolutely famous games came out on this thing. Of course you had your basic Pong games, but also absolutely revolutionary games. Breakout, Space Invaders, Adventure, Tennis, while also having loads of arcade ports like Pac-Man, Galaga, Donkey Kong Centipede, Galaxian, and back in the day this was absolutely incredible to see big arcade games running on a home console. Nowadays it looks kind of gross, but still though. Like, you kind of have to take their word for it that you're currently looking at Donkey Kong. The controller was also really revolutionary, and I'm pretty sure it might have invented the joystick. Yeah, it's really simple, but it achieves at what it's trying to do. But it's very clear why this revolutionized the gaming industry, because it was really good for the time. Now we're moving on to 1979 with the Intellivision. They all have pretty good games, but they're all carbon copies of arcade and Atari games, although it was Atari's main competitor at the time. The controller was garbage though. Seriously, this thing just had too many buttons, and it was just confusing. Now pretty much every game came with controller overlays just to tell you what each button does, but that's just clunky. Also, what is with moving? You spin a disc to move. Like, this thing kind of worked on the 3DS circle pad, but like, that made sense. You didn't spin a disc. Like, that's just, something seems wrong there. I don't know how this thing sold so well, because to be honest, it looks kind of garbage. But then again, so do most of these consoles, to be honest. Now, I'm sure I've probably missed out a couple of consoles here because, well, this is the time where everyone was releasing their consoles. But really, these were the only ones that sold really well. Most of them did not succeed at all. But I still think 70s games really have their charm, and it's still fun to look back on. Even though I wasn't alive, so I don't know why I'm talking like I have nostalgia for them, when I was very, very far from alive. Roughly 35 years far from alive. But does that mean I'm going to fully convert to the 70s lifestyle, only play 70s games for the rest of my life? No, I don't think so.